Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shuchi Saraswat, and I'm the Associate Editor at AGNI. And welcome to tonight's roundtable discussion with AGNI editors. This is the sixth and final of our virtual conversation series celebrating 50 years of AGNI. We began the series in April of this year as a way to give our community a peek into what AGNI editors are thinking about, the writers they are most proud to champion, and to just really connect the editors and the writers, because they often don't get a chance to meet and have an hour-long conversation. So we've recorded all of those. If you've missed any of them, they are available to watch, and Cynthia will share that in the chat. And let's see, just a couple things before we begin. I just want to make sure we thank the Mass Cultural Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and of course, Boston University, where we've been housed since 1987 or 1988. And to all of you for subscribing to AGNI, reading, attending our events. There have been many this year, and we really can't do what we do without all of you. There is one more final event after tonight, and that is on Friday, November 4th. That is our kind of ultimate celebration of 50 years. It's going to be in person at WBUR City Space. It's also going to be streamed, so you can join us virtually if you are not in the Boston area. So Cynthia will also include more information about that, and hope you'll definitely be there for that event on November 4th. So a little bit about tonight's format. As you'll see, you have the option to be on screen, and we are recording this. So just to be aware, if you're on screen, you are also being recorded. We aren't going to have a separate Q&A session. There's a lot to talk about, and we want to make sure that we've got plenty of time to do that, but we also want to take your questions and integrate them into our conversation. So just any questions you have as they come up, just put them in the chat and we'll make sure to address them along the way. Okay, so let's start first a little bit with my role at AGNI. So I joined the masthead back in 2019 as a nonfiction editor, and in 2019, Sven and Bill had decided to expand the masthead quite a bit, and I was one of many editors who had joined. And so I was part of the nonfiction team, where I still am, with Sven and Kelly Groom and Jennifer Elise Drew. And last year, I also joined in, added to my responsibilities, I suppose. I started going to the office and working with Sven and Bill and sort of really understanding how you oversee a literary magazine, which I learned very quickly is a little bit of absolutely everything, from editing and copy editing and proofreading to getting more subscriptions to, figuring out where to print the magazine, which the last couple of years has been a big issue all over publishing, and that every little thing that we do at the magazine, we all are involved in some way. It's really just a labor of love, as you're going to find out from everyone here. So I thought, since we have all of the editors here, we would kind of build a timeline together of the 50 years of AGNI. And then I would start with Askold for that. And Askold, I'm going to read a little bit of an introduction that you wrote. This is for AGNI 26, which was the 15th anniversary issue, published in 1988. I believe it was the first issue of AGNI when AGNI was being published out of Boston University. Sharon had just stepped aside. She'd been editor alone for a number of years at that point, and had just stepped aside, became executive editor. And I think this is the first time Sven, I don't know if it's the first time, but this is certainly an issue that Sven co-edited with you. It's called Mentors and Tormentors. It was sort of the theme of that issue. And in the introduction, you take us to the beginning from 1988. You look back on 1972, and you say, where we began. In 1972, the year AGNI was founded as an undergraduate literary magazine in Yellow Springs, Ohio, Richard Nixon was reelected. John Berryman leaped off a bridge into the Mississippi. The moon lost some of its luster under the boots of American astronauts and the pens of neo-surrealist poets. We had soldiers in Vietnam, but a Supreme Court ruling effectively prohibited capital punishment. And in parentheses, Anatole France once said he hated to see young people behaving too rationally. One assumes he had different expectations for the leaders of nations. So I just thought, this was 1988 looking back, and now in 2022, looking back into 1972, take us to that time. Why did you start this magazine, and why a magazine? And yeah, just take us to the beginning.
Thanks, Shuchi. I mean, first of all, I want to say I'm delighted to be here with this group of fellow editors of the magazine. It's really lovely. We've never done this before, even though we're not far away from each other. We've never gathered together to have a conversation like this. And so I thank you all for pulling this together. And I also was delighted, Shuchi, to hear what you have been experiencing at the office, because that means that the essential sort of gestalt of AGNI has remained constant. That is, that sounds like you have been engaged with every aspect of making a magazine, bringing it out into the world. And that's always what interested me. It was like kind of every part of it interested me. So I want to take you back a little further than further back than 1972, because this really began, AGNI began as, you may or may not know, as an underground newspaper in high school. I had been the editorial page editor for my high school newspaper, and I'd written an editorial that somebody in the administration censored and refused to publish. And that was my first sort of lesson about how publishing works. We all know that A.J. Liebling quote that freedom of the press belongs to those who own one, something like that. That's roughly what it is. And that I discovered is so very true. So I very quickly learned that I did not have command over what was being over production of the journal in high school. So yeah, I needed to find a way to get the stuff that I wanted to say out into the world. And it was, it was a very particular period in American literary culture, American culture in general. It was the tail end of the spirit of the 60s. There was a whole kind of underground press scene that was flourishing, really kind of growing all over the country. It was part of what was known then as the Mimeo Revolution, an early avatar of what you are all now seeing with online journals. That is that suddenly it became possible to, with very little sort of financial investment, to produce in multiples sheets of paper. You didn't need to own a printing press. You didn't need to go through the trouble of hand setting work the way that Virginia Woolf did at Hogarth Press. You could type on a piece of wax paper and put it on a little drum and crank that drum and start producing pages with it was a kind of, what's interesting about that was that it was at the same time as what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time was the samizdat movement. That is, that there was an underground press scene going on there as well. And so these were sort of two parallel movements around the world, very different places. So the idea of running a press, the idea of being able to help to create an agenda for a conversation struck me as profoundly important. Those who put the news in front of you every day have so much influence over what it is you wind up thinking about and talking about that day. That was pretty clear to me. I also have to say that a lot of the impetus for this came from the fact that my parents were Ukrainian refugees who had fled a country where they did not feel free to speak their minds. And so the idea of speaking your mind, the idea of speaking truth to power, all that sort of stuff was really kind of essential in the motive for developing first a newspaper, mimeorag, or broadsheet, as Bill Pierce called it. And then when I went to college, my sort of interest, I went to Antioch College, which was at that time considered probably the most radical school in America. And that was sort of liberating because it felt that I could put some of the kind of political focus that had been animating much of AGNI stuff in high school aside and turn to poetry. which was a delight, and it was also a very rich time in American poetry and a wonderful thing to discover. All these sort of thrilling writers were producing, were publishing work that broke boundaries. Everybody from Adrian Rich to Robert Bly to W.S. Merwin to James Wright. These were kind of really powerful new voices on the American literary scene, and to engage with them. So having a press, having a magazine allowed you to engage with the culture. You weren't merely a consumer, you weren't merely a recipient, you were able to actually, you had a reason to write to writers, to invite them to submit work, to begin to put together an image of the culture as you understood it and as you found useful. But what I also want to underscore, that what was really important was that I wanted to know how things were made, how things were financed. I mean, I was always broke, as Sharon and Sven will attest in those years. And so I needed to know how to do these things without any money too. And in order to do that without monies, you needed to do them yourself. So when I was at Antioch, I took a printing class, and the result was the first issue of AGNI, which looked like this. I mean, it was horrible looking. It was illegible. The poets who sent work to it were appalled, and to speak to me very quickly. But it was a learning curve. I very quickly learned that I should not be involved in the production of things. That is something that I should get a second job and outsource elsewhere. And that was also useful to get that learned. You want to know how things are made, but you realize that you're not going to be equally good at making every part of it. And so I turned to concentrating on the content of the journal and looking for ways to finance it. And you'll hear me say this repeatedly, but the kind of financial underpinnings of these ventures are really important. And they, of course, scale up so that you can do a small sort of local thing by yourself in your garage. But if you really want to have reach, you need a lot of other support, and you need collaborators. And that was also something that I discovered at Antioch, where a pool of talent, fellow writers, my generation, who were themselves as excited by literature, by poetry, by fiction, by what was happening now, but also deeply interested in the history of their art. And having a journal allowed for and created opportunities for building a community around literature and ideas. And that has been, I think, an animating principle for me in publishing for all my life. And it's when I moved to Cambridge, I met Sharon early on, and we began very quickly to collaborate on doing the journal. I think, what was that first issue, Sharon? It was issue 5 and 6 that we did together. Is that right? Yeah. So that was like in 1977, so 5 years after the journal began, and the community grew from there. So Shuchi, I could go on, but I think that's a start of an answer.
Well, since you showed us issue 1, I just wonder if you could tell us, how did you convince writers to send you work for a magazine that didn't yet exist?
Surprisingly easy. It was, and again, this experience began earlier in high school. I discovered the Beats, and like so many kids that age, I was thrilled by Kerouac and Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was also the publisher of City Lights. And so I actually wrote him a letter while I was in high school and asked him a series of questions about how he got started as a publisher. So, I realized that one could learn from the source. And I was able to say very honestly how much I loved his best-selling book of poetry, Coney Island of the Mind. It was, for a time, the best-selling book of American poetry of all time. I think that at least by 1970, it sold something like 500,000 copies. And he wrote back. That was astonishing to me. And so I realized that if one were frank and direct and wrote to writers whose work one genuinely admired and let them know that, they were open to connecting, and they were willing to take a risk. as I said, some of those who took a risk on that first issue were not so willing to take a risk on the second one. But we learned and we got better and we began to look better too.
Great, thank you. So Sharon, you joined in, I think, what was the issue exactly? I think we were saying
it was issue 7. That was really the first one we co-edited.
okay.
Yeah.
And for a time it was just then you alone editing the magazine. And so you know, I have this issue, AGNI 23. I think it's probably coming out backwards there. I linked the archive in the chat so you can see all the issues. And this one was called Burning Issues, which you co-edited with Barry Morris. I think she came on as a guest editor there. And I was just, you know, reading your introduction to that, and there's this, you co-wrote the introduction with Mary, and there's this lovely moment in here where Melrose, you write, Melrose said once that love is putting your arms around someone and art is extending your arms further to encompass the world. We wanted to gather work with a large embrace, with solidarity across borders, through classes, and through time. And when I read that, that so spoke to me what AGNI is now. And I thought, you know, you're such an important part of AGNI's continuity and to keeping that kind of spirit going when you had the magazine at a time where a lot of magazines would just collapse. I mean, I think magazines don't often last, you know, after the first 10 years or so, and you kept it going. And so I want to just ask you about that sense of continuity, but also what did you want to change or you know, make different about AGNI as you had come to know it?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with all of you. I think I was very interested in really in younger poets, people who hadn't even published a book yet. And we had started a feature called The Feature Poet. And that was something that continued really for quite a while. And but we were always looking for kind of fresh voices. And some of Askold's friends had gone to the Iowa Writers Workshop. And so there was a way that those people began to feed into the magazine. And bringing in different editors from different times, like Mary Morris, who's a fiction writer, William Logan, the poet, who brought to us Irish writers, Irish poets, and British poets. We did features on both of those. There was a guest spot that Sven did on the experience of reading that happened in one of the issues. And so we've really, there was also, you know, a kind of continuity of having poets and fiction writers and not having them in the magazine only one time, kind of following them along in their career, and which is a way of supporting them. And I was also really interested in paying writers. It was very hard to do that at first, and that became a commitment. When Askold was talking about finance for a magazine, that really did become an issue as we tried to produce a more professional looking magazine, have really good typography and more interest and covers with maybe some art on them. And so we began having to enter the whole world of grant writing. So we were always writing. It seemed like it never ended, writing a grant to the Coordinating Council of Literary Magazines, or the Mass Council on the Arts and Humanities, or the National Endowment for the Arts. And we got a lot of support from all those organizations over the whole tenure of my time with the magazine. I can't think of a year we didn't have support from one of those three. And that was just vital for us to keep going. And part of our applications there began to be to have to be able to pay writers, which is was a good thing.
And I know the magazine was kind of housed at different places, right? And was it always in Massachusetts? Was it always in the Boston area?
Well, Askold, it started in Ohio, right? Well, maybe.
Yeah,
maybe
or
Jersey.
New Jersey and Ohio, then it went back to New Jersey when I moved back to New Jersey. And then when I came to Boston in '76, I brought it with me to Boston. It didn't go to BU really until the issue you held up, Shuchi, the mentors and tormentors issue in what was that, 1980 or something like that?
88.
88. Yeah, so I'd already been teaching at BU for a few years, and very generously, Leslie Epstein, the director of the program, offered us office space, and that was our we had a foot in the door then, and he was warned that once we had a foot in the door, we'd have 2 feet in the door before you knew it, and then he was right. We kept pushing. But for years, right, Sharon did this with a roster of gifted volunteer interns, right?
Oh, many who were invaluable and really wonderful companions. Especially, I have to mention Norman Dukes, who I worked long hours. We would go over poems and we would put away a bottle of Riesling, and it was terrific. And he was a wonderful poetry editor and poet. Yeah.
And I see Mike Grover is here,
I
right?
do see Mike Grover. Hi.
Who continues to be involved, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
We will actually, I might as well say it now, we will be including every name of everybody who has been involved in the magazine in the program for the November 4th event.
Oh.
And that will be available to everybody who attends, whether they're there in person or virtually.
That's wonderful because it suggests the intimacy and the kind of human scale of this project, and I think that has always been a kind of an essential thing. I've not been tempted to work in big publishing because of the kind of corporate nature of things, whereas when you can get to know the people you're working with, you create a kind of energy and you grow. Each of you grows because through conversation, right? Sharon, what you're describing is that kind of the sitting down together and talking about the poems becomes what lends meaning to the project. It's not just the product, but it's the kind of the getting there.
Yeah. And it was wonderful. I mean, I had editorial assistants that were from Harvard, like Sharona Bentov and Michael Milburn, and Wheaton College, and Emerson, and BU, and eventually UMass, because the magazine did move out to Western Massachusetts for a very short while. And so all of these people contributed, and Grant Kornberg was another person who stayed with us really quite a while. And it was working with all of those young people that I love. They were maybe 10 years younger than me, something like that at the time.
Yeah, and the managing editors have been we included a wonderful list from Eric Grunwald to Aaron Blue to well, the list is long, and I'm glad you're talking, Bill. Yeah, Valerie, with whom I'm working now again at Arrowsmith. So the kind of community continues to hold.
So continuing on our timeline here, Sven, you had been involved with the magazine for quite a while before you came on as editor. And as you're telling us about your early years in the magazine, I wonder if you could also speak a bit about your editor's notes, which are sort of a very unique thing to AGNI. I've never seen editor's notes that are standalone essays, which you had started, and now you and Bill alternate issues and write these essays that are both riffing off of what's thematically you're kind of sensing in the magazine, but also just thinking about literature and literature's place in the world in that moment in time. So I just wonder if you could talk about that. Why did you want to bring that into the magazine, and also just about your early years there?
Yeah, no, for sure. Thing about the editor's introductions, it's really a easy and cheap way to get published without getting rejected. So that's a start, I'm not worried. I just hope Bill will like what I do. As for origin, I'm sitting here and I'm just kind of wowed by the continuity factor, the fact that I'm looking at the gentleman on screen right, who was the guy back then at Antioch College in New Jersey before that, and that he's sitting here, that we know each other and have continued to for 30 some years. I had various thoughts about continuity and the passage of time, we asked various former contributors to, if they wanted to send us a little note or blurb about their experience with AGNI in honor of this 50th year. And one of the ones that came in just the other day, or that we posted just the other day, was from the poet Ira Sadoff, who was the teacher of Askold and many others of the community there at Antioch. So I thought first I'd just read about 2 sentences from what Ira said in his comment. He said, and excuse me because I'm looking nearsightedly at the phone here. He said, my association and love of AGNI goes back to the very beginning, when a very ambitious, passionate poetry lover, Askold Melnyczuk, a sophomore at Antioch, stapled together the first couple issues. Askold was one of the fabulous student poets in that class of many lifelong writers. I gave them a couple of poems and translations to help them launch this great venture, and so on. It was only a few years ago, though it's probably more than I'm thinking, that every year when we published the 2 issues a year, and until COVID, we would have an ongoing tradition of an event held at the Boston Playwrights Theater, which was founded by Derek Walcott, who for quite a time was one of our board editors, is much missed. It was fairly recently that Ira came, and I suddenly thought, what a wonderful continuity. Here's this guy who was watching this stapled product go out into the world and having a sort of benediction over these young people. And there he is, and he's still full of the juice and writing wonderful poetry. And so all of this is just, yes, time, but the continuity feels really convincing and strong. So I came to Boston at the end of the 1970s. So my very first impression or contact with the magazine was standing in Reading International in Harvard Square, seeing an issue there and looking at it. And I thought it was very cool looking, as one sometimes thought back then. And it featured a story that intrigued me by a writer named David Bosworth called The Death of Birkerts. And I took it home, and I was really taken by the whole gestalt of AGNI. I was doing some writing then, and I wrote a little piece, which is about, 10 sentences long. It was called Chekhov's Fancy, and I thought I would submit it. And Sharon mentioned Norman Dukes, who was, he truly was a presence in that time. And between Sharon and Norman, somehow I was accepted, which was a huge thrill. I remember the AGNI weird looking letterhead with the beekeeper, the beehive or whatever. And then I met Sharon, who only lived about 3 streets away from where I was living. And she said, you would really probably get along with this guy, Askold, but he's very much a hermit, but I think you two would get along. And, and we did, and so on. So what I'm thinking of right now in this segment is just the transition from staple power to massive digital output interface world. And it's so different technologically at every possible point. And yet here we are, and it still is that core thing. And that's the thing that amazes me and kind of keeps me really interested in the whole enterprise. So I'll pause on that.
But Shuchi, if I may just build on that for just 1 second, speaking of the kind of continuity, but also the power of literature to affect and determine the course of our lives, I do have to note, because I see them on screen, that one of the reasons that I came to Cambridge, and Cambridge and the Boston area are themselves a big part of the AGNI story. That it has kind of gone global and gone far beyond that is also fueled by where it was. by the fact that it was based in Cambridge and its sort of rich intellectual resources, by the presence in the 80s of writers like Seamus Heaney and Derek and Brodsky and many others who kind of came to either were here or came through town, and they kind of busted open our perhaps all too hermetically sealed kind of American literary community and helped us become international. That was huge. But the reason I came to Cambridge in the first place was that in high school, I read a story in the Best American Stories anthology called Cambridge is Sinking. It's a wonderful story by a writer named John J. Clayton, really a brilliant writer. And I didn't know John. I didn't know anything. Well, Sharon Dunn and John are married now. They didn't know each other back then, and so it's just merely the weird overlaps and the weird ways in which I feel like I live in a Calvino novel. Reading something and suddenly I look up and my world has become what I'm reading. I think that is the ways in which reading can build out our lives. And perhaps the internet does something similar too. So back to you, sorry.
Sven, what year did you come to Boston? I heard 1970, but I don't think that's right.
Oh, that's way too early. I came in the late 70s. I won't, because I can't pinpoint any date on any calendar in the timeline of my life, but it was the late 70s. And it was many years before the transition to admiring AGNI to suddenly being at its perilous helm transpired. But we'll go on to that.
Well, it's interesting to think about the really local roots of the operations and everyone, the different writers coming through and how that influenced the editors. And Bill, when you had been at AGNI for a while, and before you became co-editor, and I think you became a co-editor right around 2019. And if I'm remembering this correctly, you were really championing the expansion of the masthead, which really broke open the presence of the masthead. It's no longer Boston based, really. I mean, our operations are there, but our genre editors are all over the country. And so just talk a little bit about that expansion and why that was so important to you, and whatever else you want to talk about your transition from being a senior editor to becoming a co-editor.
Well, I was struck by something that Askold said and has said in various forms in our conversations over the years, that ability to set an agenda. And I guess, my family experience, my own history was quite different. And I had the same experience of working on a high school newspaper and brushing up against the censors at a school and fighting with them and so on. And I had been involved in publishing in that way myself from that time. But I didn't feel, my family did not come from a country where our broader agenda was being restricted, the agenda of living decently. I am not of a race, that has been restricted in those ways. I am not, so for me, there was a kind of, I wanted to decentralize the process. I had kind of chafed in that way for a while. We had genre editors and they played an important role, but we didn't have a codified way that they could decide that something would go in the magazine, even if, let's say, Sven didn't want it in the magazine. And so when we doubled the size of the masthead, which greatly diversified the masthead in several ways, racial and otherwise, we also came up with a kind of process that would make sure that we weren't going to edit by committee, which I think is, a disaster for a magazine. We don't want to edit by consensus, but I also didn't want to be, I don't want as co-editor to go off to the side with Sven and just make those decisions without reference to, just sort of take in the advice and then go off and make the decisions. So we came up with a way that you know, if any two of us who are genre editors, or, you know, you as associate editor, Sven, and me as co-editors, any two of us want a piece in the magazine, after our conversations, which are very collegial, and, you know, we're all swaying each other all the time, but after that process, if two want the piece in, then it's in. And to me, that is very important, because it means that, and Sven and I, so one of our decisions, Sven and I can't be the two. So if Sven wants it and one of the other editors in a genre wants that piece, then it's in. And that means that if two of our poetry editors want a poem in, and we talk with them and we try to sway them away in a particular case, and they say, well, yeah, we hear you, those are good points, but we want that poem in, we believe in it, and then it's in. And so to me, that decentralizing of the process, it gives more of us a chance to set that agenda. You know, I don't feel the need, and I totally understand why Askold did, and yet you saw him sharing over the years with Sharon, giving it over to Sharon completely, sharing it with guest editors. Sven was a guest editor a few times along the way before he became editor. So even then, I mean, there was an urge to share that role. But even so, it was a more centralized role that was being shared. And so I kind of had just the hope that we could move, and Sven and I had great conversations about it, and easily agreed that we would do that. And I think it's been fantastic. It's a lot of work. It's a heck of a lot of work, because, you know, you want to keep everyone, first of all, feeling engaged and understanding the influence they have, and also talking, so that we're all influencing each other, and we're not just letting things go through because someone wants them. It's not that simple. You know, we have to push back and discuss, and we're being pushed back against as co-editors all the time. And that process, to me, is part of that. It's a kind of extension of that sense of community that both Sharon and Askold have talked about. That it is a 21-person community on that masthead that is, for me, just a very immediate part of my social life, my intellectual life. The people in that group are as important to me as the people here that I've known many years longer than many of the people who are now on the masthead. And so, yeah, it's been a very rich and, I think, successful experiment so far.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Askold.
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, I applaud that, and I also recognize the complexity of the structure you've all created, and I marvel. But I suppose the technology is part of what makes it a little bit more workable than it would have been in our day when everything was done by mail or telephone. But I want to say that we had, you know, back in the day, we'd started something called the Poetry Panel, and we had people like Robert Pinsky and Aaron Blue and others who would meet once a month to look at the poetry submissions and decide what went in. And each of them represented a different aesthetic. And I have to say that those are wonderfully rich discussions. I mean, after all, part of what literature tries to do is get us talking and thinking and comparing notes. And so to have a to formalize that and ritualize that in a way, make that part of your daily life or routine, sounds like a great way to live. I also just want to mention that one of the other sort of eruptions in Cambridge, and it was a very important one, that really changed the dynamic and I think helped lead AGNI to where it is today, and that was the presence of the darkroom in Cambridge in the when was it? When was it started? I'm not forgetting. The late 80s, I think.
Late 80s.
Yeah, the late 80s, and Thomas Ayers Ellis, Sharon Strange, Kevin Young, Natasha Trethway. The youngest member was Tracy Smith, who's, you know, as you know, became poet laureate here. They were all kids hanging around in Central Square and chafing against the kind of hegemony of a certain kind of editor over the literary output of these old United States. And, you know, you see how the power of community and the kind of concentrated power of a group of, deeply gifted and ambitious young folk can go ahead and change the entire kind of makeup of a culture of 300 million, and as they have, when you consider the influence that the group of people who met there in the late 80s, their presence on the scene, Kevin at the New Yorker, blah blah blah, et cetera, et cetera. That's I think that the moral there is just that, get a group of gifted, high-spirited, talented, and determined people together, and you can change the world.
Oh, the world, I don't know, but something. I wanted to just, I've been thinking to get inside a little bit of the subjective ongoing experience of editing. I know that for me, from the start, it gradually emerged. I mean, I knew that we were a community and in a community, and not having to make decisions kept me at a distance from the real life of what happens. But what I discovered then, and still have to this day, to this morning, is the complexity of literary human relations within the web of that community. Because one of the first things you find is that you have a great many talented people and friends who are also, some of them, donors. You have people who are happily published elsewhere. You have people who, to put it most simply, there's a, I don't know how to visualize egos, but they're there to be visualized and they're there to be tendered. And every day, when I look at submissions, which is one of the main things I do, I'm very much aware of the inner life of the feelings of writers versus the notion of what one would deem excellence at a level that I would want to promote it to, my fellow editors, knowing right away that, every time you hit the reject button, there's a little sad pang, always. And one knows it from oneself having been panged or pinged. And so there's this, it's just an environment that you're in. You're looking for the best. You're really trying to keep the ship going. You're aware of a community of loyal, intelligent, literary people, and you're navigating constantly among who they are, what they want, what they expect, how easily they might, be offended or hurt by a decision you make. And that never resolves. That's all I want to say. Having a larger masthead makes it easier, because then you can do a little bit of a good cop, bad cop scenario. Say, well, the poetry editors admired this, but it was much harder when you were one of the people who were on the record for that piece. So there is that. It's a kind of decentralizing of responsibility in a way.
Kind of like a firing squad.
What?
Kind of like a firing squad.
Yeah, a little bit. Right. So yeah, that's all. I just wanted to throw in the behind the scenes, in the head work of sitting in front of a laptop, scrolling and making calls and decisions, and knowing with each one that it has an effect out there in the individualized community of writers submitting, and that never goes away.
That's so true. It's certainly one of the reasons that I was, happy, ready to leave the magazine in 2001, because I was really tired of saying no. And so much of editing is saying no. And I'd love to hear how Sharon and Bill and Shuchi, how you guys deal with that. I started another press called Arrowsmith Press, which is by solicitation only, precisely because I did not want to be in that position again. That and being 10,000 pages behind on my reading every morning were kind of tough. Yeah, I'd love to hear. Those are partly the realities of all editing. That it's the case at the level of AGNI. Imagine what it is like at Forest Rouse, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So I don't know, Sharon, Bill, Shuchi, how do you guys live with yourselves?
I think I I did always try to write a note that when I was returning material, where I tried to find something that I could say something good about and something encouraging about. And I felt that that's what I owed the writer for having given me the chance to read his or her work. So that was a very important part for me. Other than being tired of, I didn't, when I handed AGNI back to Askold, it wasn't because of saying no, it was because my eyes were so tired after all the reading. I really, that was really it. But in terms of, sending material back, that's the greater part of what you do is send material back, and poems and stories and essays. And so I think, my way of dealing with it was just to try to imagine that writer.
But Sharon, do you have any sense of what you were dealing with daily? Because now it's easily 100 submissions are there waiting every day.
Every day.
Every day. I mean, three genres, but
I thought way back then, the way I thought about it, I thought that I read 1,000 stories a year and 10,000 poems.
Yeah. Well, we during the pandemic, that was our high. Before we started to charge $3 a submission, precisely because we couldn't handle the numbers. We hit 21,000 submissions, and of those, I guess, if you say maybe 4 of them, or let's say 5 of them were nonfiction, that would leave, if I do this math right quickly, that would leave 8,000 poetry submissions, each of which would be 5 poems roughly. Right. So that would be 40, let's say 30,000 poems. So the numbers did get too out of hand to write a personal note back.
Yes.
Much as we'd love to do it.
So in this, I'll throw into the mix also the fact that I don't think this existed way back when, but the ease of multiple submissions has hugely affected what comes in. People write a story and send it to 8 places, and there's just this multiplicity factor. And honestly speaking, going through, it's not like one agonizes over every attachment one opens. The agonizing is fairly rare, actually. Quite a lot of the work is possibly competent, possibly many things, but it's not for us. And that's visible to me within a page, I would say. And all of those people don't, get the letter. They get a graded rank of rejection, either a very favorable rejection or just a regular one. And then there's a decently sized group that gets at least a note or a word, and that word, as Sharon says, is usually one addresses what was submitted, and tries to frame the rejection while acknowledging what we saw in it enough to allow a letter to be written, sort of. So
I have to say, I learned from the master, because even though Sven has talked about, liking not having the responsibility all on his shoulders, I mean, he's very, 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 very gifted at turning people down, turning friends down, and encouraging them at the same time. So much so that we receive still, but we used to receive even more when there were more of that kind of note going out. Hallmark cards, literally thanking Sven for his rejection. Because he lands where the story is, where the poem is, and helps with a reaction in those rare cases. And in the not just rare cases, but cases where the person submitting is a former AGNI contributor, is a friend, You know, people would say, again, I haven't had this question for a long time, but people would ask like, well, why don't you take submissions blind? You know, well, the problem with taking submissions blind is that then there's some, you know, then you're pretending that you're not affected by the work you already know, the people whose work you'll recognize without their name on it. I mean, we are turning down work by people we know well all the time. And you do have to just get good at that. And I guess the burden of it grows over time. But I don't know, Sven has done that and maintained friendships. And I've worked to learn
Tested
that.
sometimes too, though.
Sorry?
I said he's tested them sometimes too.
Yes. Oh, yes. And I'm sure I have too. But I've really tried to learn that art from him because, you know, it's a very personal, very human, just intimate one-on-one reaction that happens quickly, but happens, you know, heartfelt, and it's it makes a difference.
I have a question about, somebody asked me this the other day, and it was, how much actual editing do you continue to do? I mean, line editing or major suggestions, a suggestion that it's more likely to be a story, that some element of it shift and let's look at it again. Does that still happen for you? How does that go?
That sounds like a Shuchi question, perhaps.
Well, yes, absolutely. There is so much editing that happens. So, I mean, well, I'll say from the nonfiction side of things, and I think this is true for other genres as well. But certainly for nonfiction, we have taken essays that have needed quite a bit of editing, but we've felt that there was something there in the voice or in the story being told that we weren't seeing, and that we wanted to help bring to the level it needed to be at in the magazine. And so we have gone through pretty significant editing rounds with writers, and usually we do tell them in advance that we're interested in this, but would you be open to editing in this way? And so we engage them right away, knowing that, you know, making it clear that we want to edit quite significantly. And so that's, I mean, I wouldn't say that happens often, but I would, you know, maybe 2 or 3 times an issue. Yeah. Would be on the high end of things.
In nonfiction.
In nonfiction.
I don't know. No, in prose. Happens in fiction too. I don't know if it happens in poetry as much.
That's what I thought.
But line editing, that happens in every single genre, and in poetry just as much as in the other genres. And this is something that I've learned quite a bit from Bill. Bill's editing philosophy, which I'm going to pass over to him to talk about a bit. I mean, we edit everything, and we always approach editing as a conversation that we're having with the author, and it's always the beginning of a dialogue. We're not editing to any particular standard or style, and it's not, you know, either you take these or you don't. It's always a conversation that is a form of respect to the author and their work. So Bill, I'm gonna, you know, this is very much your philosophy that I've been sort of, you know, learning over the last year or so. It's been really
well. I mean, you know, I at this moment and several earlier ones, I just kind of want to list the names of our current editors. I mean, we rely so much on them, and you know, Jennifer Elise Drew is one of our. She's an editor at large now, one of our nonfiction editors. She has been with us. Well, I think she's technically been at the magazine longer than I have. I started in 2004. And she is an absolute master of prose editing. She is an extremely gifted editor who's edited many books. She's edited more books just by virtue of the fact that AGNI writers have then turned to her and hired her, asked her if please she could carve out some time to do their book, you know, for major presses. And she was Hunter S. Thompson's personal copy editor for his last few books, and did many books for Grove and other presses before her deeper AGNI involvement. But, you know, we have well, our whole fiction team works together on it. Mary O'Donoghue and Julia Brown, our fiction editor and our editor at large in fiction, senior fiction editor, Mary O'Donoghue, they do that kind of, whether it's not quite a developmental edit, but a bigger edit, or it is, really key line editing throughout. They do that often with the input of our assistant fiction editors, who have phenomenal taste and skills, and we've had them spearhead some also. So really, I mean, there's almost no limit to like everybody on staff is, and Jess Stark, our poetry editor, and Jennifer Kwan Dobbs, our senior poetry editor, are deeply engaged with that. They are extremely skilled line editors of poetry, and it's something that I have done here for years, and it's not something that I, or now Shuchi and I, do alone. We do it with a huge team, and different people take the lead in different cases. But I mean, Jennifer Kwan Dobbs said, and it was only half joking, that we might for a time take on the marketing slogan, "We edit, period," because so many journals don't. And
That's right.
Shuchi said it already, but put it slightly differently. I like to think of it as kind of editing from within the spirit of each piece. We read the piece, we try to become ventriloquists of that piece, and what it establishes in tone, in spirit, in intent, and what it may be here and there doesn't quite hit, where it's missed the mark that it established, and then try to help the writer. So the one thing I teach our editorial assistants all the time, who tend to be MFA students at BU, is that, at the beginning, when I started out and I had our first interns during my time, I would be happy to pass along their questions. They'd have all sorts of, well, this feels awkward to me, well, this, like, notes in the margin. And that caused all sorts of debates, bad blood with our contributors. And we almost never have that happen now. And the reason is that we edit with specifics. If we think something's awkward, we rewrite it as much as we can. If it's a sentence that feels off, we rewrite it. And that's not to have the writer take our version. It's to show them exactly what we would mean by saying something's awkward. Like, it's in this direction that we're thinking it needs to go. And so some writers now and then, all writers now and then will take those suggestions. But what happens over the course of an edit for a piece is that, in some cases they'll say, no, actually that bit of roughness is what I want. Or they'll say, yes, what you've suggested is just right. Or they come back and say, oh, okay, I see the issue you're raising. I see the problem, and I've solved it this way. And I think that when you're talking about writers at the level that we're able to attract and publish, they tend to understand why we've proposed the edits we've proposed. We don't have to tell them why. We just have to show them the thing we're thinking, and they can then run with it and do what the piece needs.
Can I zoom? That's great. I'm so glad you're doing it, and really impressed to hear the detail and thoughtfulness with which you're pursuing this. Can I just zoom out though for a minute, because I realize our time here is short, and now that I have you all here, I'd love to hear how you see the literary culture today, because this is a moment for a little retrospection, right? And when I think about what the literary culture was like in the 70s when we started, not just the literary culture, but not just the popular culture, but the culture, American culture at large, and at this particular moment, where I think in a very singular moment, in perhaps a major inflection point in this culture. So all the sort of the openness, the variety, I'm trying to avoid all the kind of familiar buzzwords about the range of voices that now do have places in the literary world. They did not when we began. But I do think that we were always active in trying to create those spaces, and we did. And now I think that they're really widely, that attitude has become the norm. Once something becomes the norm, surely one is also wondering, what is not happening? What is being missed? What are the conversations that should be taking place? Because if everybody's talking about the same thing, if everybody's taking that sort of same line, using that same language, because grants require it and so on, then I wonder if there's not a kind of something is being overlooked. And we're also in a very kind of tricky political moment in this culture. And I wonder, AGNI in my time was very politically engaged. One of the issues I was most excited about working on was when we did with to celebrate Amnesty International's 40th anniversary. It was a really international issue looking at censorship and so on around the world. And I wonder whether you see literature playing the same role or having a kind of role in political culture, and what are the sorts of issues that you are finding? What are the things you're hearing too much of? What are you not hearing enough about? And are you experiencing any kind of pushback of censorship? That's one of the things that I fought against that at BU as well. In fact, we almost got pushed out of the university, and it was thanks to our robust board of advisory editors and outsiders like Joseph Brodsky that we managed to keep our place there. So there have been so much of my experience of AGNI was a lot of struggles and a lot of fights and a lot of battles. And I wonder, are those still happening? So I'm sorry, I asked you all a bunch of questions, but I'm really curious to hear answers.
I'm here to say good things about you, Askold, but I do have to allow that you've brought up that end this last year plus with everything you've been doing on behalf of the Ukraine, which has been extraordinary. You've created a whole vast, and I think leading anyone else anywhere sort of forum, voices on the ground and talking to writers and philosophers. So I think you keep us safe on that score for a while. It's really a hard line to call between being a literary journal and whatever is the most open, flexible, and good definition of that, and letting political thinkers and writers do their work where they do it. I think it would be a real danger if we just became a political forum, that's not who we are. And there are plenty of people out there who are, creating and sustaining political forums. But same token, we could never not have included and, been grateful for what you rather amazingly have done. And I think that when you're finished, the energy will pretty much be gone and you'll be finished. Not really, no,
Thank you for that. Yes.
Luckily, that won't happen for a long time.
No.
Oh boy, I feel like we've opened such a large other conversation that we need to set aside an hour for this sometime in the future. The same cast of characters, or maybe add some of our other editors to it also. I'm not. There are some aspects of the premise that I can't really accept. I mean, the idea that it's become the norm. I mean, yes, accepting a wide range of voices into literary magazines in America has become something close to a norm. That I think we can safely say. To extend that to publishing in New York, we cannot safely say. And then once we get out beyond that, I mean, we know that the country is, I can't say that there's more hatred and xenophobia now than there was 10 or 15 years ago, but it sure as hell is more visible and it's more open. People feel that they have the right to say all these things out loud and to act on them with guns. So I feel like we're deeply involved in the work that we're publishing. It's literary work. It's not political. but it is deeply political in its heart. And we're aware. I mean, Sven has taken flack for this too, talking about a magazine as sort of reflecting the zeitgeist, and at every moment he has used that term a lot. At every moment, reflecting a changing zeitgeist, which means a changing magazine. That doesn't mean publishing political screeds or political essays that are that are not also explorations of language and ways of telling. But it does mean being hyper aware of what's happening in our world, not just in our literary world, but in our world, and crafting a magazine that's written by writers who themselves are deeply affected by it, aware of it, and writing with kind of attuned to it.
Shuchi, what remains to be done?
Remains to be done. Well, I think, oh gosh, I'm not sure I can say what remains. I can't even really see what remains to be done, other than that there seems to be an endless amount to be done that we can never keep up with. AGNI Online was a way that we could, I think, we're always sort of limited by this biannual journal as far as being, how political can we be if we're talking about something that has happened that will have changed in the weeks that follow, and that may be stale by the time the magazine publishes 6 months later. And so we're always navigating that in the print journal, and AGNI Online has actually given us a way to engage a little bit more immediately. And so to me, what remains to be done is exploring that, exploring what we can do online, in our limited means, as far as, staffing and time, and still putting out the quality of a print journal that we keep trying to do. But I think the dispatches from Ukraine, which you helped bring to us, was just the beginning of us seeing, okay, how do we tap into this international community we've been connected to for so long, and start to address other areas, other regions that have not gotten that attention. And I know when we decided to start publishing the dispatches, I remember one thing that felt really important to me was that we kept doing it because there was an immediate response in the literary community. Many people were publishing dispatches, and it felt important that we don't stop doing that because it's fallen out of the news cycle, and that to really stay true to what we do is that we keep on publishing those dispatches as long as we can. And so, because again, there's so much work to be done, it's what projects can we take on and do with that kind of thoroughness, and really do well. And I think, we want to do so much, and it's always a matter of really, sitting down and thinking, can we actually do this? Right. Not, yes, we can do this, but are we going to do it in the right way?
Well, one case in point in the last few years was COVID, because there was a time, which we all remember, where everything was COVID. Just the world was COVID, and we didn't know. And we got so much writing coming in over the transom in every form, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, that was deeply based in the COVID event shock. And at some point, I think we individually, but I'm sure we talked about it too, we just realized we can't let this be completely defining. We need to respond to it, and if works really, really get at it in a way that suits our particular sensibility, we should welcome them. But we can't just suddenly turn ourselves into a forum for COVID narratives. And we didn't. And it was hard because, when people write in, they're writing out of the, whatever, sincere pain of what's going on. And it's very hard to look at that and say, well, it's not quite for us. We get what you're saying, but it does mark a part of the editorial deliberation that goes on around any issue. It's like, how far do we go with it, and how far do we try to keep the perspective that we see in a larger sense is our perspective, which is many things, not just that. So
Exciting.
what was the word? Exciting.
Well, also, I wonder if would you talk a bit about Aerosmith and sort of this next evolution of publishing for you? What does it look like, and yeah, what are you doing with Aerosmith, which is I think mostly online, right?
No. We're now publishing
Yes, publishing books. Yes, that's right.
8 to 10 books a year.
Yes.
We've got a pretty robust season ahead of us. I think we've got 5 books coming out in the spring, and so talk about continuity. Aerosmith is named in honor of the great translator of classics and Italian literature, William Arrowsmith, whom I met at Boston University, and who really kind of underscored the importance of giving translators their due in a very unforgettable way. We had published a series of his translations from the Italian of Eugenio Montale, and had kind of credited him in the way that translators used to be credited at the very end of a long poem. It said, translated by William Arrowsmith, and he wrote me, yes, exactly. He wrote a furious letter back saying, what the hell, you would never know who Montale was if it wasn't for me. I mean, he didn't say quite that, but that was the gist of what he was saying. And so he said that translators need to be getting equal billing with the writer, kind of the writer's name / the translator's name. I was a little shocked, but I saw his point, and I've never forgot it. I realized that again in so many other sort of traditions, it's the importance of the teacher, the person who brings to the culture, it's a key role, just as you are all playing key roles now in bringing these voices to light. So I think it should be the poet's name, the translator's name, and then the editor's name right after that. But okay, so with Aerosmith, I've tried to put into practice some of the things I learned at AGNI, and that was again to not open the floodgates to endless sort of submissions, and I simply could not manage to do that. It's a press that I underwrite myself, with occasional kind of gifts and support from friends, and so it's at a very sort of small scale, but I have been hugely lucky by having a brilliant senior editor, Ezra Fox, to accompany me on this, or he came into work at with me about 5 years ago, and he has helped develop this kind of whole huge online presence. We have really kind of in the last few years, we've published some fabulous books of poetry that I could not believe our good fortune came into our hands. Most recently, the first book of first book in English translation of a 91-year-old Swedish poet, Lasse Soderberg, translated by Carolyn Forshey and Lars Gustav Anderson. We published we published a book by Romeo Oriogan, who just won a major national African prize for $100,000 just a couple of days ago. We published the first book. So we have continued, I think, in the spirit of AGNI, but have been publishing books, which I keep trying to say to Bill and to you, Shuchi, is where you might consider the future of AGNI. Let's talk about partnerships here. Let's put it on the table in a public way. There's something hugely satisfying about bringing into the world something that will have an even longer shelf life than those classic issues that you're producing now. I could.
Does that exist? Askold, AGNI 1 is, I mean, we keep it in like practically under glass. The shelf life is going to be infinite.
No, but you know what I mean. I'm tempted to read the roster of writers whose work we are publishing, but I fear I'd forget someone, and I'd rather not.
Another time you'll be doing that, yeah.
Yeah.
Askold, I have a question about, you also publish stories and essays online, isn't that right? but not in a print journal. Is that correct?
Yeah, so and we actually don't publish. We've only published one work of fiction online, and we haven't published any fiction in print. So it's only poetry in translation, and essays. And the essays in the journal are generally tend to be on topical subjects, so there are also occasional reviews. The only story we published online was by the fabulous Iranian novelist Shahryar Mandanipur, and it was just such a damn good story that we broke all precedent and put it out there. He's somebody whose work I will always attend to, and yeah, we've got a pretty exciting spring planned with an anthology of again Ukrainian poetry and Ukrainian writers in exile, selected by Ilya Kaminsky and Carolyn Forche. That's going to be coming out in the spring. We have a brilliant book of poetry by Sharon Santos, a writer whose work I've admired for decades, coming out. And in fact, we'll be publishing our first work of fiction. This is also a little precedent breaking and is making me nervous, but it's such a fine book by the Irish philosopher Richard Kearney. So that's some of the stuff that we have in store coming in the future. And thanks for asking, Shuchi.
Yeah, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and I want to make sure I ask one last question, and that is, we're all writers here, as many people are who are involved in literary journals and work at literary journals. So how has your work as an editor fed your writing life? So for all of you, answer.
Hugely. No. I mean, it's incredibly nourishing if you can be disciplined and get to your own work first, and not turn to the pile of manuscripts or the work that needs to be edited. It's hugely nourishing because it engages you with writing in a way that's helpful. Again, if you know how to angle it, you get to look at other work closely and understand and learn things from it. You get ideas from it, and at the same time, if you've developed enough of a sense of your own voice and self, you won't be drowned by it or overwhelmed by it. Really, only kind of strengthened by it. But I'd say, but you got to get to your work first.
That's true.
Yeah, for me,
I'd say one can be stimulated by certain amount of intelligence in what one reads, but also makes me competitive. I bring a competitive thing back when I'm not looking at submissions. So you're seeing in many cases the best of what's going on in your genre, or much of the best, and it does take you back to the desk with a kind of slightly fired up attitude.
Sharon, what about you?
For me, I feel like it's just that I'm swimming in the same sea as my fellow writers. So there's kind of companionship, really. That's really more what I feel.
Yeah, I don't feel the competitive thing either, at least especially not from editing. But what I've felt is I love hands-on editing. It's one of the things I love most about this job. And that process over the years, from the very start, back in 2004, has just taught me time after time how people construct their atmosphere, how they create the sound of their work. And I learn it most from what writers push back against, what they don't want to do, how they don't want things to change. Or when they do change them on their own. I mean, I had a wonderful editing process with Melanie Ray Tone, where she loved our suggestions and changed her story hugely, not in ways that we ever would have anticipated. And just watching that process and learning it, it taught me so much about how to think about the atmospheres, the tones, the textures of my own work, and has been really hugely influential for me.
How about for you, Shuchi?
Oh. I think that close line editing has just, has been so great in making me and making me stop being so lazy about the language that I use in my own sentences. You know, I am kind of being so precise at every word and looking and questioning the word in a sentence to see if it's working for someone else. And then when I'm writing, I can feel that looseness. And so it's always that juggle between, you know, what comes out and what feels fresh and authentic, and then having to figure out what actually someone else can read and understand from that. And it's just practicing that again and again in editing that feels invaluable to being a writer. You know, creating and then stepping outside of yourself and being able to look at it again from a fresh set of eyes. It's pretty great, but I'm still learning. So all of you.
It never ends. It never ends.
Never ends.
And you know, I want to thank you all for being here. This is a pretty special moment to have everyone here together. And a lot of us will be together on November 4th. Many of our genre editors are flying in from all over the country. Bill is holding up a QR code for you. If you want to scan that with your phone, you can get tickets to the event on November 4th. And yeah, it would be wonderful to see all of you in person. And if you can't attend in person, you can watch online as well. And I want to thank Cynthia, who has been in the chat, linking to various things, and to Ari Kaplan, who writes our newsletter and who's been in the chat as well. And yeah, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Shuchi.
Thank
Thank
you.
Yes. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great to hang out with you all.
That was fun.
Look forward to more.